So first question, I saw your statement, you and the governor's statement a couple of days ago when the president first threatened that he was considering sending federal law enforcement officers to Michigan. Yesterday, he said it was now his intention to do so. He's saying it's under the auspice of protecting federal property, like the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon. Does that argument hold any water with you as it pertains to sending law enforcement to Michigan?
Well, if law enforcement is being sent for the purpose of crowd control or anything in regard to the protests that have been taking place, I would say your help is not needed, nor is it really wanted. We have not had the same kind of violent protests that we might have seen in some other cities. Any kind of criminal violations have been fairly minor, and certainly nothing that our local law enforcement agencies in Detroit cannot and have not been able to tackle without any additional assistance. So that's not necessary, and I also think that it's actually very bad for the public to have what you saw in Oregon, in Portland, where you saw federal agents that did not have name identification badges. We didn't even know necessarily what agency they were from, taking protesters off the street, shoving them into unmarked vehicles and taken to God knows where. I mean, those are all the hallmarks of an authoritarian regime. That's not how we operate in the United States of America. And so I would say if that is the intention, that certainly they ought not send federal agents to Michigan for that purpose. And I think, if anything, it would just create a more dangerous environment, and it would serve to, pour gasoline on a fire. Not that we have a fire to begin with. So for that purpose, I think it's a very bad idea. But I will say that now in recent days, the president has sort of changed his tone a little bit, and now he's indicated that he wants to send in federal agents to assist in terms of more traditional types of law enforcement, which would be to coordinate with state and local officials and law enforcement agencies to tackle an increase in violence that we've seen. And I think it's very obvious why this has happened. We're in the course of a global pandemic. We have massive unemployment. We've had thousands and thousands of deaths in this state. And there's a lot of unrest due to all of those factors. And so if they want to come in and coordinate and help take guns off the street and assist us in more traditional means of law enforcement, then I think we would welcome them, and we'd welcome a coordinated response. We have those kinds of task forces have always existed in our state as long as I've been practicing law. And in fact, we have a number of different task forces that are operating right now, where we work with federal agents, local agents, and state agents. And so that's a traditional type of law enforcement, and we would welcome that assistance.
And we have to tack onto your point there, we have seen more shootings in Grand Rapids for sure over the last several weeks as well. Just by happenstance had Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist with me yesterday on an entirely different topic. We were talking about his COVID minority task force. But I did happen to ask him about this because the president had made his statement on his intent to send federal agents in not an hour before I had the lieutenant governor. And he said that the governor's office is looking at all options on the table to try and prevent them from coming in. Now, if this is the former circumstance you were talking about, as opposed to the latter, is your office looking at anything legally to try and keep these federal agents out of Detroit as well?
Well, we absolutely are, and I will say that in Oregon, what the Attorney General in that state did is she filed a federal lawsuit against the federal government. And what she alleged in there were a number of types of constitutional violations that these agents were involved in. First Amendment violations, because of course protests are a protected form of speech. Fourth Amendment violations, which violate search and seizure provisions, and then also Fifth Amendment violations because they were violating the due process rights of these protesters. Seemingly, there was no probable cause to arrest these individuals or take them into custody. So I would do the same thing here in Michigan. I would make every effort to fight back against the federal government in the event that they sent agents in and they compromise the constitutional rights of our state residents.
Where does that appeal go? If you were to file those briefs, what's the first court that would see those papers?
Generally, that would happen in federal district court, so it would depend on where it happened. For instance, if that occurred in Grand Rapids, that would be filed in the Western District. If it happened in Detroit, it would be the Eastern District. But those are the types of actions that we would likely take. Again, that's a very different scenario for those, the way those officers or those federal agents came in. They did not coordinate with the local police. They were not asked to come in by the Portland Police Department. So can you imagine the anarchy that ensues when all of a sudden you have these individuals on the street, the local police that are out there and have been out there day in and day out protecting their populations, don't even know they're there or who they are. And suddenly these people are being forced into a vehicle. I mean, you would assume that these people are violating the law and that they're kidnappers of some sort. In my opinion, it's even possible that some of those individuals, if they're not following the law and if they have not been deputized to enforce state law and they are not properly enforcing federal law, that they may even be committing a crime. So that's something to look at as well. Now, there are certain circumstances where it is totally appropriate for federal agents to come in and to operate and under state law. Now, those are circumstances, for instance, where there has been a request from local law enforcement and they're working together. Again, totally appropriate under those circumstances. Or when there is an emergency situation. And an emergency situation would be defined under our Michigan statute as a sudden or unexpected circumstance that requires immediate action to protect the health, safety, and welfare or property of an individual from actual or threatened harm from an unlawful act. But I would argue that what we are seeing in terms of these protests, these are not emergency situations. And even if they are emergency situations, there should be a coordinated response with local and state law enforcement, or else, widespread anarchy would result in what we're seeing in Portland is it is just making the situation worse. Not only is it not making things better, it's making the situation far more hostile and volatile. And that's the last thing that we want to see. So I would, and frankly, we've never seen that before. The only circumstances really where we have seen federal authorities come in without having been invited by local authorities were really the integration cases of the 1960s
Schools, yeah.
and in the 1950s, when you had court orders where the local and county, law enforcement and state law enforcement refused to enforce those orders. So the federal authorities had to come in and enforce those orders. And you can still remember, of course, where you have agents that are escorting school children into schools and things of that nature. But this is such a far cry from that. This is a totally different set of circumstances. So federal agents, like I said, when it comes to crowd control, when it comes to monitoring the protests, I think it is a very bad idea for them to come in. But if they want to help us in regard to pursuing, violent criminals, as long as it's a coordinated response, I think that's totally appropriate. And it's the same thing that's been done for years and years. But I will say this, Nick,
Yeah.
I'm very suspect of the president's motivation here. We have had, violent crime has existed in this state throughout the tenure of the president's term in office. And here it is, less than 100 days out from an election. I don't like the fact that he's brought politics into it. What he does is he calls out Democrats who are in office, our Democratic governor or Democratic mayors of these cities. And he has turned this very political. And law enforcement should never be political. It should never matter what the political parties are of office holders when you're deciding how to enforce the law. So I'm very concerned. And I'm very concerned about the language that the president's used. When he talks about coming in and dominating our state residents, that scares me. And the last thing I want to see is the constitutional rights violated of our state residents because the president is trying to score political points for his reelection bid.